You are listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I am your host, Celine Yeager. Each week, I bring you advice from athletes, scientists, researchers, and other experts to help you feel and perform your best, no matter what your hormones are doing. This show is a production of Live Feisty Media. Hello, strong, feisty women. So, November is National Diabetes Awareness Month. So it seemed like a good time to bring up a topic that I know is on many of your minds, prediabetes. I hear from many of you who are concerned that your fasting blood glucose and maybe A1C numbers have gone up and maybe into prediabetes ranges. And you're concerned, and I get it. As I have spoken about many times on this show, this is something that I have wrestled with myself. And I've done a lot of reading and interviewing various experts over the years. And honestly, this issue is anything but straightforward. So I'm going to do a couple shows on blood glucose. And the first is this week with past guest Val Schonberg, who is a registered and licensed dietitian with a master's degree in nutrition science, as well as a board certified specialist in sports dietetics and a certified menopause practitioner. And we just get into it. We talk about insulin and insulin resistance and prediabetes. And spoiler alert, and this is something that I did not know, the World Health Organization does not recognize the term prediabetes. And we'll talk all about that. And of course, then we talk about how diet, exercise, lifestyle, and hormones play a role in all of this. And I want to be clear right up front, we do not have all the black and white answers here because there are no black and white answers here. But I think there's a lot of good food for thought and plenty of reasons that we don't have to panic, as many women are. And I'll drop some of the resources that Val has created on this topic into the show notes so you can dig in even further. I hope you enjoy her expertise as much as I did. And stay tuned for an upcoming episode with Dr. Nicola Guess, where we talk about blood glucose in active women and athletes specifically. Like I said, I want to dig all into this because it's something that I have been thinking about literally for decades. All right, before we get to it, give us a follow at Feisty Menopause on Instagram and Facebook. Join our Hit Play Not Pause private Facebook group. And head on over to feistymenopause.com and sign up for my free weekly 40+ newsletter, which also features many stories about you. Last thing, very quick thanks to Previnex for their long-term support. I saw a review from an audience member, Anne, who is 60 years old and is thankful for Joint Health Plus for helping her to continue to feel good. She says, quote, "I am not stopping the supplement." Me neither, Anne. And thanks, Previnex, for your long-term support. All right, enough of me. Let's have a few words about those awesome sponsors and get on with the show. Well, welcome back, Val. It's good to see you again.
Thanks. Thanks for having me back. I'm very excited to have for this conversation.
Well, and it was nice to have you as a buddy at the Menopause conference this year at the Menopause Society meeting. We had a great time in Chicago, and you went to a nutrition meeting after that too, correct?
I did. Yeah. Yeah. I presented at FNC, which is our food and nutrition conference. It's kind of like the mothership for dietitians. And that was in my home state of Minnesota. So that was really fun too. Lots of conferences.
Nice. Well,
Hmm.
today we're going to talk about something that I know that you have written about extensively and is interesting to you and to me, and that's this whole subject of insulin resistance, carbohydrate sensitivity, blood sugar levels rising, all of this stuff that happens during the menopause transition, especially. And I see it in our audience all the time. So active women do not seem immune to these things. I am one of these women. I always have been. So I am selfishly interested in this conversation as well. So I think the best place to start, Val, because you wrote about this recently, and I thought it was fascinating because I forget we're very US centric, and I know this podcast actually goes broader than that, where we have maybe 180 countries. There's a lot of countries. So this is going to fall in a lot of ears in a lot of different ways, but I always tend to just look at the US guidelines for things like how do we define insulin resistance or diabetes or prediabetes and all that, forgetting that it's not necessarily the same across the board, right? So
Mhm.
let's establish out of the gate level set what insulin resistance is and what prediabetes is and how we determine those things.
Okay. Sure. Well, I think when we're talking about something like insulin resistance and diabetes and prediabetes, and even just hormones in general, which both of, us expose a lot to in the menopause space, I always like to acknowledge that these are very complex issues. Hormones are super complicated. Some of the stuff, the moving parts that have to do with insulin resistance and diabetes are impacted not only by like lifestyle, but hugely impacted by genetics or even things like social determinants of health, such as trauma history. So before we launch in, I always like to make sure that people understand that this is something really complicated that we're going to simplify for the point of the discussion. And yet, keep that in mind because sometimes these simplifications then become generalizations. But the way I like to help people understand even something like insulin resistance is to think about it from the fact that we eat food. And when we think about like carbohydrate type foods like fruits, starchy vegetables, grains, our body breaks those down in digestion, and then we end up with glucose. And the important part of that is that we need to provide energy to the cells in our body for all these essential body functions. And so, how do we get the glucose in the bloodstream into the cells so that our body can use it to fuel physical activity and to fuel all these essential body functions? And this is where this idea of insulin comes in. So, insulin is a hormone that is made by the pancreas and it helps shuttle the glucose that ends up in your bloodstream into the cells in your muscle, your fat, and your liver, where it's used for energy or it's stored for later use, which is actually really important. And so if you imagine like insulin, we use this analogy a lot, that insulin is like the key that unlocks the door to the cells that can get that sugar in, and so it can be used for energy. So then insulin resistance is when the cells in your muscles, your fat, and your liver are not responding well to that key to insulin. And then we can't get the glucose out of the blood as well. And when that's happening, the glucose stays around in the blood. We refer to that as hyperglycemia. That can have some problems down the road. And also, we're not getting that energy into those cells to be used. So obviously, there's lots of problems with that. So that's insulin resistance. And then did you want me to go into prediabetes?
Yeah, I think that's the natural
Yeah.
segue.
So then that leads us to prediabetes, which what I talk about is I think it's more accurately referred to as impaired glucose tolerance or impaired fasting glucose. And this is kind of where some of the debate around the world comes in, which we can get into. But this is when the blood glucose levels are above the normal range. I should say, quote unquote, the normal range, right? Like, how do we determine that? But below the range required to diagnose type 2 diabetes. So what's important for people to recognize is that prediabetes, and this is one of the problems with the word itself, is that it's not a diagnosis. It really, even the World Health Organization does not use the word prediabetes. They prefer that we refer to it as impaired glucose tolerance, but the intention is the same. The purpose of having a pre-diagnosis or pre-disease kind of criteria is that what we've learned is by the time people develop type 2 diabetes, they already have some of these microvascular complications. So we really want to catch it earlier. And so that's where there's nothing wrong really with the differences in how people are defining it or screening it, but it's recognizing that that's part of this story. And the purpose of having prediabetes or that criteria is so that we can start to identify who are those people who really are at risk for developing type 2 diabetes. That is the most important part of that. The problem is what we've learned is that the criteria for, kind of identifying these people is really incredibly poor in terms of predicting who's actually going to evolve into type 2 diabetes. And especially in older individuals, there's even more problems with this criteria. So we've seen this in research where people who are within those boundaries of prediabetes, only a small amount actually develop type 2 diabetes, and many revert back to normal. So, in fact, there's a large 2018 Cochrane review that shows that almost 60% of the individuals who had that prediabetes diagnosis or met that criteria reverted back to normal glycemia within 1 year. So that becomes problematic. But I would say it's a little bit like how I think about mammograms. I mean, this might not be the best example, but any of us who have gone through the, suspicious tissue on a mammogram. So then you get a diagnostic mammogram and then you have a biopsy and then there you go. You do it again and again. And there's a very small percentage of women who, actually, when they have a kind of a false positive, develop breast cancer or have breast cancer. It's kind of similar. Like, look at this as a screening tool, and it's not perfect, but it's what we have to work with. And it gives us an opportunity to assess for lifestyle and some of those factors.
Thank you for that. And thank you for explaining that because too often I think that people hear prediabetes and they hear, oh, it's like this foregone conclusion that I'm just going to keep on the slippery slope or I have to make these radical changes. And we'll talk about that. I want to talk a little more granularly about how the parameters of
Mhm.
prediabetes, the diagnostic criteria that
Sure.
are across like the WHO or the American Diabetes Association, how they determine their numbers. I understand that we want to catch it early. I guess my question becomes, let's just say the ADA sets their, fasting plasma glucose at 100, where the WHO sets it at 110. If I sit at 110, am I experiencing more metabolic damage than if I'm sitting at 100? Are the like why are these lines drawn that way? Do you understand
Yeah.
what I'm?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's probably where the debate is. And
Okay.
that's where you would have to ask some of the researchers to kind of say what they've seen, because clearly the ADA had its reasons for lowering the threshold. Because even if you go back and look at time, even the 110, it used to be even higher than that in terms of the diagnostic criteria. So, it's continued to be lower. We see the same thing in cardiovascular health when you look at blood pressure parameters
Right.
or cholesterol parameters. And so I think it's just that as researchers and epidemiological research comes out and says, hey, we got to catch this a little bit sooner, I think that's what sets those standards. Um, but I also think where it gets messy is when we get into this older population, because the pre-diabetes criteria, like, so some of this glucose tolerance comes along with aging.
Hmm.
And does that necessarily mean you're going to have microvascular complications? That's really the question, right? Like, are you going to develop type 2 diabetes? Are you having some of the problems that can come around with that? And I think that's really where it would probably depend on who you talk to. And I guess I say this with everything. You can't just look at one biomarker anyway. You have to look at the whole picture. What else is going on? So if you have, say, a fasting blood sugar of 110, but you have low triglycerides, low lipid panel, or well managed. Your weight is healthy. You're an exerciser. You eat well. Well, that probably would tell us another part of the story compared to a whole bunch of other criteria that comes into play. And then it really informs the intervention. But kind of to circle back to, there's more going on than just even a fasting blood sugar, right? So we have three ways that blood glucose is measured to determine whether the body can maintain that proper balance, right? So we can look at fasting blood glucose, like you just said. And for most of your listeners, they probably had this where you go into the doctor, you haven't had anything to eat or drink for 8 hours, and then they just do some blood work and you'll see like a glucose number on your blood work. And if it's greater than 100, they're going to say that that's impaired fasting glucose. If it's greater than 126 milligrams per deciliter, then that's a sign of type 2 diabetes. And in comparison, you said like the World Health Organization and even the governing bodies over in the UK, they would say 110 milligrams per deciliter or higher is sufficient. And frankly, when I look at the data, just my, kind of uneducated way of thinking about it, 110 seems just fine to me when you look at where the curve starts to go up for those changes. But um, the other thing is hemoglobin A1C, though. So
Just
I
gonna
think
ask that.
this is the other big one. So it's simply referred to as A1C. So that's how listeners might hear it, but generally on your blood work, you're going to see it listed as hemoglobin and then A1C, which is different than hemoglobin that we kind of check throughout our whole life generally. So that's a different measure. But A1C is a blood test that really tells us what those blood glucose levels have been over the previous 3 months prior to the test.
How do they know that?
How do they know what?
I always, I mean, how do they know how,
Yeah.
what is
So
the
I think because
biological indicator that they're seeing
I
that's
think
like,
it's
oh, the blood
related
sugar levels have been this for over 3 months? Like, how does the test say that?
because I think it's related to the half-life of the hemoglobin molecule, right? So the sugar attaches to the hemoglobin, and then that's why if someone has anything that's affected their hemoglobin, right? Like iron deficiency anemia that we might see in a perimenopausal woman potentially, or even you had a knee replacement, you had surgery, or you had blood loss for some reason. All of that can impact that hemoglobin level, and then that's going to throw off that A1C. And then
Okay.
there's other things that can throw off A1C as well, which are stress impacts that, glucose production. It's not necessarily insulin resistance or a problem. It's just someone has stress or someone has an illness. You had COVID. That's going to throw off those sugar levels, and that might get reflected in that A1C. And so there's a lot of those things that can influence that A1C number. And so some think it's really reliable and sensitive, whereas the World Health Organization says, nope, it's not really that sensitive because it is affected by these other factors. And so the World Health Organization does not use this test in defining their criteria for what they term as impaired glucose tolerance, because they don't use the word prediabetes either, for the very reason that it's not a disease and prediabetes suggests a disease. So those are kind of a couple of the main ones. But in the UK, they, for example, will use A1C, but they'll say 6% or higher versus we rely on 5.7% or between 5.7 and 6.4. And so there's just this variability, which, for most of us women, I think one of the most common things I'm hearing is, oh my God, they're so confused. There's so much conflicting messaging. And it's like, well, you are going to get a lot of conflicting messages in this space, and it's for these reasons. And it's just that it hasn't really been hammered out. And there's just a difference of opinion. And I think we have to be okay with difference of opinion, but then we have to put it in proper perspective for that individual so that they don't attach the fact that my A1C is a 5.7. And so that means I'm going to get diabetes. This horrible thing is happening. It's like, not necessarily. Like, let's take a look at a lot of reasons that that number might be what's going on there, and what is the trend, what has been happening over time, and what else is going on in your life, and what are your lifestyle patterns. And so it's just a clue. It doesn't really tell us much, if anything, until you look at it.
So there's also a 2-hour oral glucose tolerance test, right?
Yeah.
Is that diagnostic, or is that also a screen?
Yes, yes. So according to the World Health Organization, they would prefer to use impaired fasting glucose and or oral glucose tolerance test. If it were me, I'd rather have an oral glucose tolerance test. And there can be some, I guess, sensitivity issues with this too, but you know, anyone who's been pregnant might be familiar with a test like this because you do it during pregnancy. It's similar in that the test measures how your body is responding to ingesting glucose. So you would go to the doctor in a fasted state. They would take your blood glucose and then you would drink this horrible sugary beverage and you'd sit around for 2 hours and then they measure your blood sugar a couple different times. And especially at that 2 hour mark is where they would determine if the blood sugar hasn't come back down. Okay, well, that tells us that your body is not shuttling that glucose out of the bloodstream. So is that happening at the cellular level, at the muscle and liver, or is that happening because the pancreas and the beta cells aren't getting the sense to like put insulin out there and do its job? And so that's why an oral glucose tolerance test, in my opinion, would be if I were curious, I would kind of want to have that happen. It just doesn't get done as much because it's time consuming. And I think there are some debates on how reliable it is, but the World Health Organization seems like it's pretty reliable. Um, and that's where everybody agrees. So that's the other thing, is that an oral glucose tolerance test of 140 to 199 would be a sign of prediabetes, and then 200 milligrams per deciliter or higher. So again, after that hour mark would be a sign of type 2 diabetes. But again, any of these tests generally need to be redone, right? Like we never just take one test in isolation. And so to keep that in mind. But yeah, I think that some of this has really been a problem for midlife women, especially because of some of this glucose tolerance issues can come through the menopause transition and with aging. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to develop type 2 diabetes. It doesn't necessarily, there's no way of really telling is the beta cells, because type 2 diabetes is really about beta cell dysfunction. And so insulin resistance could contribute to that beta cell dysfunction. But until the beta cells in the pancreas really kind of aren't doing their job in putting insulin out, insulin resistance in and of itself isn't really probably, I mean, there's ways to address insulin resistance, exercise being one of them.
Well, I was going to ask, like, wouldn't insulin levels themselves tell you part of that story?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean, they could, but again, there's going to be so much variability. Because even if you look at like the research around active individuals, like probably a lot of your listeners, what they'll show is oftentimes insulin levels are lower, right? Like the body has become so good at being like, oh, we've got this load of sugar and things we got to do, and it can produce a small amount of insulin to manage that compared to someone else. So, looking at those insulin levels would be another biomarker that someone could measure, but that's going to be some variability with individuals. So you just look with, is it in the safe range of what it would be? But in terms of diagnosing or identifying the criteria of individuals who are at risk for diabetes, generally we're looking at those three blood markers of glucose specifically.
And let's talk a bit about the GLUT4 pathway, because we haven't really talked about that. And you talk about active women. Like there are other ways to get that glucose out, right? We talk about
Yeah.
our muscle like being metabolic sponges, and this is sort of going to lead to questions down the line as to why active women in this age group sometimes still have high fasting glucose and A1Cs, despite being very active, where you think we'd be pulling all of the glucose out of our bloodstream. But we can also talk about estrogen as part of that picture. But let's establish that pathway first, like how muscle activity and contraction help with this glucose absorption.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's thinking about the muscle contraction or the exercise, if you will, for simplicity, kind of like doing what the insulin would do. So, as a way to get that glucose across the barrier to the muscle to be used for energy, that is, really the mechanism behind where exercise becomes a way to do that. So if you think of someone with type 1 diabetes, where they are not producing any insulin, right? So then they have to exogenously give their body insulin to manage the glucose that they're taking in. But theoretically, if you ate a bolus of, carbohydrate type food, you could do exercise to clear that glucose out of the blood through a physical activity. And that's where type 1 diabetes it gets really tricky, right? Because you certainly wouldn't want to totally do that. I've seen people try, and it's scary to me. But kind of working with both of that, because if you're giving your body too much insulin, for example, and then you're doing physical activity, well, now we're going to end up with hypoglycemia.
Right.
So then we're going to have low blood sugar, and that's not good at all. That has a lot of problems with that. So yes, I think physical activity, that's why when you look at, say, the diabetes prevention trial or program, even when they looked at like midlife women, menopause, for example, wasn't a risk factor for developing type 2 diabetes. And so the diabetes prevention program is what we look at a lot for. It's a robust trial with a very good lifestyle intervention. And I think the number is that just through lifestyle, when you have someone who has that pre-diabetes diagnosis, that through healthy eating. That does not mean carb restriction, by the way. Balanced eating, as well as physical activity. And again, the physical activity parameters are like greater than 150 minutes a week. These aren't like crazy numbers. that they can reduce the development of type 2 diabetes by 58% is what they've shown in that trial. And so that's why we always look back to lifestyle first and foremost. So then if we have someone who already has an active lifestyle, they're doing a bunch of physical activity and they're eating relatively well, and then you're starting to see some of these numbers rise, well, then you have to look at, what else might be contributing to that. And I always say, I mean, people don't like to hear this, but you can have the healthiest diet and be really healthy, physically active, and potentially still get type 2 diabetes. So it's a very low risk, and we want to like remember all the environmental factors we can address, but there is a genetic component. And when those beta cells just kind of get sluggish and run out for a bunch of different reasons, just like some people lose hair and some people don't. I think there's a lot of factors. And so for an athlete to say, I should be immune to getting diabetes, I think that's where they might get frustrated and confused. And kind of, I think we were talking about this offline, but when you look at some of the fluctuations in blood sugars when someone's using a CGM and physical activity and they're freaking out because they're way outside the, what's the normal range? It's like, but that normal range is for other people. Like, I think it needs to be reassessed for active individuals because we're not seeing the development of retinopathy in masters athletes, for example.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And is there a differential there as far as the effect of those levels on the system is what I'm curious about? Because when I wore a CGM and I would go on a 4 hour bike ride, I would see you could almost put my CGM graph over the top the topography of the elevation graph, and they
Mhm.
would match. Like I would go up a hill working very hard, and the blood sugar would go up. I'm not eating anything. I'm just on my bike.
Mm-hmm.
And I would go down the hill and they would drop. It was very reliable. And the same would happen if I was at CrossFit or doing something. Anything really hard, it shoots up. I also saw with stress. I got a stressful call at 10 o'clock one night and it looked like boom, like this little rocket ship goes up. So where, what is that mechanism? That's just the body releasing sugar into the blood to just do the work. But
Yeah, I
it's
mean,
not coming from any food. I'm not eating in any of this while I'm watching my blood sugar go up and down.
right. Well, I mean, that kind of brings us into the cortisol system, right? I mean, that's the purpose of the cortisol stress system is like, let's say that you're, you got a bit, you're not riding your bike in a very fun, enjoyable way, but instead you notice that a lion is going to come after you. So what the body has learned to do is to have this whole cascade of hormones to say, get sugar into the bloodstream because you need to run and we need to get sugar to these tissues, right? So the body knows to adapt to a stressful a stressful situation by releasing by releasing these blood sugars. So that's, in my opinion, I could be completely wrong. You might have to ask another endocrinologist to explain this, but that is part of that system. I had an individual who has a significant history of trauma who was sitting in a therapy session with a CGM, hadn't had anything to eat for, during that time or certainly even before. And her CGM went off because her blood sugars had reached a very high level because of some work that they were doing. And so it was fascinating. It was really good information. Like we looked at it from a positive standpoint of, okay, this isn't something you're doing wrong. So I think that's the other thing is when we think about a woman getting a diagnosis, again, I have to quote unquote diagnosis of something like prediabetes, it sets women up for panic and stress and worry because the idea is I've done this to myself. I'm eating too much sugar. I'm eating too many carbohydrates. I'm not doing enough exercise or I'm doing exercise wrong. All these problems. And then it's kind of the lose weight at all costs because tend to be gaining weight during this time period. So then that's the problem. And I think that's where we need to have better information so that we can make better informed decisions about our health and not panic so much about everything related to this. So, I've read some of these reports of athletes who've done their CGM workups, and they're kind of like by the end, it's like, okay, that's interesting, but it doesn't, what purpose does it serve except for that it's maybe really interesting information.
Well, that's what I shared with you, and I'm on an enjoyable bike ride. I'm not being chased by lions. I am working very hard. I'm working hard though, and we know exercise is a stress in and of itself. But when I was working with Super Sapiens, which was a CGM company that was working with World Tour Pro athletes, they were dumbfounded by how high and how long people would sustain certain blood sugar levels while they
Hmm.
were exercising. And I would see that myself during a race. And they actually had the settings different for exercise than when you're just sitting around.
Hmm.
When you worked with their algorithm or you went on the app, they had different levels that you could expect to sit at
Hmm.
depending on what you were doing. And it all just begged the question, to your point, what does all this mean? And they didn't seem to know either, quite frankly.
Yeah,
Because
and
of these devices were made to be built, I'm sorry to step on you there,
no, that's
for
right.
metabolically unhealthy situations, not for active people out doing these things.
Absolutely. And so I think there's an opportunity there to like just like you observed, like, okay, but I want more information to, take care of my body or to even fuel for that activity so that you can do longer rides more successfully and more enjoyably. I mean, there can certainly be some good information, but you're exactly right. Like some of those devices, some of these measures have not been set up with parameters that are for that population. And so, you know, when you think about like even the cortisol system as a whole, it's a pretty simple system, and the brain and the body, you can think yourself into stress, right?
100%.
To the body doesn't know the difference as to whether you are being chased by a bear or you're just thinking about something stressful or you're on a climb and on your bike. And so it's recognizing, okay, so then what does this mean? Because if your body puts out that sugar, then there's a really good chance that your body's utilizing it.
Right.
And so it's not sitting around
Right.
unless we did have like an insulin resistant situation. But that's where I think when you look at generally exercisers, we don't necessarily see that play out. Again, I was telling you about a study where they looked at masters athletes between the ages of 40 and 70, and they were elite competitive athletes. I guess it was like the Pan Pacific Masters Games. And they found that, in those athletes, I believe it was 14 out of 40 of the participants had type 2 diabetes. That was a super small percentage of everyone that I don't remember how many they had total, but there were 40 participants that had other diseases at this age. And of that, some of it was hypertension and a small amount. So there can be this really, really small pocket, probably less than 10%, that have that genetic variability and might develop type 2 diabetes. For the rest of everybody, yeah, you're going to see these fluctuations in blood sugars, and they're maybe going to feel really confusing because you're using criteria or data that wasn't really set for someone who's doing that level of activity.
So let's let estrogen walk into this conversation now
Oh,
and
we love
how
estrogen.
how that fits into the picture. Because as I was telling you before I hit record, there is not a week, sometimes a day that goes by that I'm not hearing in the group, 33,000 women in that group, you're going to hear a lot, but I hear this a lot from all of the communities that I'm in, that women hit the menopause transition and they're seeing their blood glucose go up. They see the A1C. They start venturing into prediabetes, if we're going to use that word. And yeah, they start getting kind of freaked out about it. So why do we see this happening during the menopause transition? What is the role of estrogen in blood glucose and insulin sensitivity?
Um, well, I think, there's a lot that comes into play with that. I mean, estrogen, we know, does lots of amazing things. And so when it goes away, it doesn't definitely has an impact on some of these essential body functions. So when we think of glucose tolerance, certainly estrogen is going to have a role. So what we understand about estrogen is that it does improve insulin sensitivity. So we think about the muscle cells, the fat cells, the liver cells. Estrogen has a really important role at kind of keeping that lock and key shiny and working well. And so then when estrogen goes away, things might get a little rusty potentially, right? And then, but estrogen does so much more than that too. Like estrogen has an anti-inflammatory effect. And how does that impact the whole picture? Again, remember, like I said at the beginning, insulin resistance, diabetes, all of this is super complex, and we're talking about it in simplistic terms for the sake of our listeners, but plus I'm not an endocrinologist, so there's limited ability for me to talk about that. But even if you think about the impact of depleted estrogen or even fluctuating estrogen on lipid metabolism, right? So we don't have, estrogen is really like pro fat oxidation. And so if that's not happening the same way, well, then we potentially have some of this lipid circulating around. And my understanding in terms of the development of some of this is that lipids can have a really important negative impact floating around on insulin resistance or developing insulin resistance, just that cells situation, as well as the beta cells. So, estrogen is super protective. And yet, when we think about that, and I will think back to when I started studying this all, over 10 years ago, I was like, this is it. This is why women are gaining weight. It's because of this. And I've learned that that's not true. I mean, it could be for some people, and it could be part of the puzzle piece. But I think even when we think of insulin resistance, if we think everything is about estrogen, well, then we're potentially missing an intervention. So if estrogen is a big part of it, which I think it does have an important role, and then when you look at the menopause hormone therapy or estrogen-related hormone therapy, obviously that might have some type of a help for certain people. But we have to look at other factors that contribute to this, which is the aging stuff. So, we're naturally losing lean tissue. And what is that skeletal muscle? But actually that depot for that insulin stimulated glucose disposal. So this is why I know in your group, you guys talk a lot about, resistance training. This is why this is important because yes, endurance training is super helpful and important. I want people to do anything they enjoy. And yet at the same time, if you are getting concerned about this and you're kind of checking all the boxes off, you really got to look at the resistance training box too, because that maintaining as much of that skeletal muscle as we can is really important because our lean tissue includes our organs. We can't necessarily exercise our organs. So some of this is going to naturally happen with aging, and that is also a place for insulin stimulated glucose disposal. So that is something we have to consider. The other thing that hardly ever gets talked about and is very well put in the literature is weight cycling. So if you are losing and gaining and losing and gaining, you can look at the Biggest Loser study. You can look at many studies that are out there. This leads to insulin resistance and a case of hyperinsulinemia. So, again, does that happen to everyone? Probably not. And that's why you don't see it all the time in studies, but that's the same with estrogen. Because even if you look at the story about the relationship between insulin resistance and stage of menopause, well, first of all, the studies are a bit limited, but there are studies that show there is no association. We often hear that there's tons of association, but one in particular, I don't know if you've read this one or heard about this one, but it's a longitudinal study. It's a 6-year follow-up study. It was kind of done in the Mediterranean, so it's kind of a limited population, but they followed women through different stages of menopause for 6 years. And what they found is that it didn't matter what their menopausal status was in terms, so fasting glucose, insulin resistance, and type 2 diabetes was not impacted by stage of menopause or weight gain. And so by the end of the study, 30% of the women were postmenopausal. They had all gained weight during this process because of age. Largely age is what the authors kind of talked about. But that is one example of where, okay, well, that story didn't show up. And I could give you 3 other studies that have similar kind of results, that when they're effectively managing, measuring insulin resistance using something that they use in research studies to really detect insulin resistance versus the stuff we talked about, they don't see a relationship. And so then it kind of begs the question of, okay, well, then age must have a really important factor in some of these scenarios.
What did you make of the study that they presented this year at the Menopause Society about the meta-analysis that showed hormone therapy significantly reduced insulin resistance?
I mean, I thought that was a really interesting study, and I like that Daniel Lee. And I've seen some of his other research, and so I really like his research. I think a couple things on that is that it's a meta-analysis. So yes, that could be helpful, but I've also seen that that's not always the case. I mean, I want to say like it makes sense. It makes sense that they're going to see the benefit that they saw, which was a slight benefit in that meta-analysis to using menopausal hormone therapy. But I would say that these days, I always want to caution that you can also look at studies that show women who haven't used menopause hormone therapy and they haven't developed insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes either. So we definitely have to be careful that that might be a really great intervention based on age and stage of menopause and some individual factors, like great idea, great intervention. And for other individuals, that doesn't mean you have to use menopause hormone therapy to manage insulin resistance. And I think that's the message I would want people to hear.
And that bears out in the community and what I hear. I know plenty of women who are on and have been on for a while menopause hormone therapy who are still running into these elevated A1Cs that we started this conversation talking about. But it it is another piece of the puzzle, and yes, for some women could be
But here's the
useful.
thing I would say to even that. So when we say elevated A1Cs, like how elevated? Like what is the number that we're talking about? So let's say that it was someone who was at 5.6, they went on menopause hormone therapy, and then it crept up to 5.7, or
Yep,
maybe it's even 5.8, for
pretty close.
example.
Not me,
Okay,
but some people I've heard
but
of.
the hormone therapy could have been really helpful. Like
Mm.
maybe they are someone who does have some of that genetic risk factor for developing type 2 diabetes. So then the menopause hormone therapy is delaying that onset.
Mm.
So that is really where it's not that it's not helping. In fact, it may be attenuating something that if you wouldn't have used it, you might have been a 6.2 by that time. I mean, I think there's a lot of, we could say that even about weight gain for that matter. The argument about does menopause hormone therapy, if taken at a certain time, kind of attenuate weight gain and fat redistribution. And I think there are some studies that say that it can help, but eventually it catches up anyway.
I see what
Right.
you're saying.
So, I mean, there's research that shows that yes, it might at that particular time be really a good intervention, but then in the big picture, kind of the body's going to get its way. I always say, do not battle with the biology. Work with your biology.
I fully understand that. And to that, some people would say, well, then put it off as long as you can. And for the 4 years I've been doing the show, I think I just have come down on we are all at N of one, which we know, and hormone therapy does seem to have X, Y, and Z effects on some women and not those effects on other women. And women there's many ways up the mountain. So if you are still experiencing this or you want to try something else besides hormone therapy, there are other options too. And that is a good segue into where diet fits into all of this,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
especially carbohydrates.
Yeah. Well, I think there's kind of a myth or disinformation that carbohydrates cause diabetes, right?
Yes.
So just culturally, we have this idea that people who have diabetes or get type 2 diabetes, they're just people who sit around and eat carbohydrates all day and they cause their diabetes. And that is absolutely not a true story. And that has contributed to quite a bit of stigma and also food fears around these kinds of foods. And so when we talk about carbohydrates, we have to remember carbohydrates are a huge group of foods, right? They're first of all plant foods, first and foremost. So when we look at the research around plant-based diets, there is really amazing research that shows the health benefits of that. Now, when I say plant-based, I do not mean a diet that's void of animal foods. It just means you got a lot of diverse plants going on your plate pretty consistently. And so when you think about the role of carbohydrates in all of this, you know, really thinking about what are we eating? So are you just eating spoonfuls of sugar, which is the way some people talk about this, or are you having sweet potatoes and blueberries and frankly bread and pasta fit in as well? And no matter what it is, even if it is the spoonful of sugar or the blueberries, at the end of digestion, it's still going to be a glucose molecule. So there's differences that, is certainly complex to that story in terms of fiber and nutrients and blah, blah, blah. But in terms of what we're talking about, in terms of glucose metabolism, they're all going to get broken down to glucose. And then when we think about, the way I like to talk about carbohydrates is including those nutrient-dense carbohydrates as much as you can, but how are you consuming it? So if we're having something like a sweet potato, we're probably having it with some type of protein and with some type of fat. And how that glucose ends up and shows up in the bloodstream is different than the spoonful of sugar.
Yep.
And so that might be like kind of to our previous conversation, why athletes are super interesting area to start studying because you are probably taking the equivalent of some spoonfuls of sugar to actually fuel efficiently that exercise. I mean, that's the sports nutrition angle of that. But for most people, in terms of general nutrition, carbohydrates fit in very importantly and well. And that does not mean you can't have a cookie either, or that you're going to get you're going to get fat or you're going to get insulin resistance if you eat that cookie. It's just that what are your everyday foods and what are your sometimes foods, and carbohydrates really should fit in as a whole. So yeah, that's kind of probably the most I can say about carbohydrates, but there's more to the nutrition story.
Uh, I'll let you tell more to the nutrition story and then I'll ask my other question.
Yeah, I think partly, and I think we've talked about this a lot, is that is not a lot of people are very afraid of carbohydrates.
Yes.
And so what's happened is people have latched on to the eat more protein
Yep.
because that really fits. And I think that's where more mixed messaging is coming in because we talk about all these different ranges of protein intake. And then we just kind of dismiss carbohydrate. And so I think people are left with thinking, oh, I'm supposed to eat all this carbohydrate or all this protein. But I think all of us probably collectively, even if we have differences in terms of targets, would say protein, but not at the expense of other nutrients. So it all has to fit in together. Now, there's some interesting research being done even in terms of diabetes and remission around diabetes, looking at the role of carbohydrates and protein. And we don't really need to get into all of that, but the point is for most healthy people who are exercising, you're going to do quite well by balancing your carbohydrate with your protein and your fats, focus on high quality foods. And if you are under eating carbohydrates, it's probably not working out great for you in the long run.
What do you mean by that? My personal experience was somewhat paradoxically, my blood sugar was higher when I was restricting my carbohydrates. And I don't know if that was associated with being in low energy availability or low carbohydrate availability. But when I started to allow myself to actually eat carbohydrates again, my blood sugar went down.
Oh, see, that's a good thing.
Yes.
Yeah. So I might have missed the first part of how you said like what, so what happened at the beginning?
Well,
Tell
when
me
I
that.
when I was there was a period in which I was training where sort of paleo was becoming this big
Mhm.
thing, and I was experimenting with that, and my blood sugar was going up, and I don't know if that was stress related or LEA related or
Mm.
what related, but when I introduced them back in normal amounts, my blood sugar became better.
Yeah. Yeah, I know we have a lot to talk about with that. So I think there's so many things that could be going on. On the one hand, when people have low carbohydrate availability, they often have low calorie intake overall,
Mm.
right? I mean, It's really hard. And even if you do look at a pure keto diet where it's a very low carbohydrate intake, you're getting most of your calories from fat anyway. And so the problem with that picture is that if you are in a very low carbohydrate situation, almost in ketosis or even specifically testing for ketosis, and then you introduce carbohydrates in, the body doesn't know what to do with that. So you are going to have glucose intolerance.
Right.
And that is very well described in the literature. This is not a medical mystery. This is a true story.
That's so interesting because at the time there was the whole idea of paleo for athletes. So what you did was not eat your carbohydrates all the like in your normal life. But
Mhm.
then when you wanted to do your thing, of course you needed the carbohydrates. You would eat your carbohydrates when you were running, cycling, triathlon, swimming, all of that.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think I had mentioned to you, like at this large food and nutrition conference I was at, I had this privilege of listening to a keto researcher who was amazing. He was so brilliant, and he talked about how that's one of the worst things you can do.
Anyway,
I
I
mean,
didn't enjoy it. It
and
didn't
he
work out well.
his research is on the benefits of a keto diet for all kinds of things, brain health related and stuff. And he basically said people who eat low carb or keto during the week and then just blow it on the weekends, that's actually metabolically one of the worst things you can do. So maybe he's wrong, but he seemed like he knew what he was talking about. And he comes from a very large research lab here in the United States. So I'm going to kind of take his word for it. And it makes sense because we do see that potential kind of problem that's showing up. I think the other thing that happens is that when someone has, so let's say that someone though sustains it. So then you have low carb, moderate protein, high fat. Well, then when you look at those studies, and Kevin Hall has some studies that show this as well, who's a big researcher, NIH funded research here in the United States as well, that, almost always shows elevated LDL-C or LDL
Mm.
cholesterol. So we're kind of like looking at like that's a problem. And that's, I guess, one of my questions is when then people do talk about a low carbohydrate, higher protein diet for managing type 2 diabetes. I guess my question is well, first of all, it's really hard for most people to sustain no matter what. And so then we're going to have inconsistent eating and that they're going to see me probably for disordered eating at some point. But the ramifications on LDL cholesterol are pretty well cited right now. And so that feels like, if you were doing a risk assessment, I don't know if having a heart attack or developing cardiovascular disease is such a great idea.
What should women take from this? We've given them a lot of information in biology, physiology. What should we take from this? These women in my group, myself being one of them, who want to be healthy and we're looking at our blood glucose and maybe we've established that perhaps you shouldn't be freaking out and that's a good take home message. But
Mhm.
in your mind, like if you were to sort of summarize like the takeaways that we should take from what we've talked about and how we should be thinking of it, what would they be?
Well, I think that what you just said is probably one of the most important. And that would probably be my biggest message is let's take a breath, like calm down, don't panic. Definitely have work with, a registered dietitian or, talk to someone who can help you kind of look at your lifestyle and see, is there some of this chaotic eating that's happening? So if you think your nutrition, and most women, especially my pretty active exercisers, think they've got their nutrition nailed down. And then when I meet with them, I'm like, they're very often low energy availability. And I think you had asked about this earlier. So just to kind of segue, one of the kind of interesting conversations to have with maybe someone else down the road is that so low energy availability, if you really think about it, or like our anorexia clients or even hypothalamic amenorrhea, they generally have insulin sensitivity. Right, they
Hmm.
usually have lower insulin levels and insulin sensitivity. So I don't know that low energy availability really tells the whole story. It could be a cortisol thing, right? There could be that stress reaction, but they have super high stress. If you look at someone like look at Dr. Schufeld's literature where she compares the functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, young women with the postmenopausal women, they were the one with the elevated cortisol and kind of messed up, endocrine profile compared to the postmenopausal women. So I think that's another thing is low energy availability. Low energy availability is not a good thing for a lot of reasons. But I don't know that that tells the whole story. Like if we're going to tell someone to eat adequately and get your blood sugars back, if they're doing this back and forth, that might actually be aggravating the problem. So we do have to look at things like, are you eating enough fiber? Do you have high quality sources of protein? Are you potentially overdoing protein? Now some of the messaging is 50 to 60 grams of protein at a meal. I don't know if that's a great idea, especially if it's just a big piece of steak and, it's kind of the bacon butter steak, diet. Like, no. If you want to have a higher protein intake, we've got to focus on, you know, different kinds of protein. And I think that's kind of carried over in terms of the, butter is the new health food thing. So that's what I would say is get someone on board to really assess your nutrition, help you stabilize it for your health, because sometimes the nutrition implementation that people are doing is to combat weight problems. And so it's kind of the lose weight at all costs mentality, which is unfortunately taking a hit at their health. And that's, I think, a great opportunity. I see this in bone health as well. When someone realizes, like, holy crap, if I don't get my what together, I'm really going to be seriously at risk of osteoporotic fractures. And that is not how I want to live the rest of my life. So I always say this stage of life is a fabulous opportunity to do this preventive health care, go do these screenings, and then reevaluate your nutrition. Because yes, it's changed. It's different. We can get all upset about it and fret about it, but the reality is something's changed. That doesn't mean we can't help you manage it, and you can live a lifelong, many years ahead, very healthfully.
That would be where I'd drop the mic, but I need to ask about because you've alluded a couple of times to the effect on protein in this picture. And what is that when you talk about blood sugar?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I don't know that I have a great answer, but when I think about it and I look, just clinically at people's diets and they have these pretty high protein intakes, they're usually at the expense of carbohydrates, right? So then we potentially aren't eating enough. And in that environment, what the body's going to do is potentially not oxidize all those amino acids anyway, the way we are telling them to eat more protein for the benefit of supporting lean tissue and all those important things. But instead, the body picks up on the fact that I have low carbohydrate availability, I have low energy availability, and I got these amino acids laying around. So let's use that because it can convert those into glucose and keep up that blood glucose level. And so I'm always curious what that means. However, we talked a little bit about Nicola Guess. I know they're doing some research around those higher protein levels, and I think they are seeing a benefit in terms of potentially glucose control. So I don't know, but I do think that I look back to the 1960s when people were eating a lot of high protein, and that's what contributed to the recommendations of people need to eat low fat. And it was tied into the protein intake. And I almost just feel like, are we reversing this? Like we don't have great data to say for older women what we need to be having. We're getting better data and we get emerging data, but super high protein intakes. And again, when I'm saying that, I'm saying like this 50 grams or more at a meal feels excessive to me. It doesn't really line up, and it doesn't line up with some of the leading protein researchers, which have kind of had more moderate numbers. And so that's just to put it in the
Yeah.
frame, because what does high mean and what does low mean is always such a relative term.
Yeah,
I mean, what do you think?
we tend to talk around 30. I would not
Yeah.
recommend. Yeah, I would not be saying 50.
Yeah. And I think, 20 to 30, depending on the individual, is really a doable, it's achievable, it makes sense. These are normal meals. This isn't like crazy amounts of food, even though people think it is. It's like, well, that's where you need me to help you kind of figure that out. And people are surprised that, like, I mean, I did like a little nutrition analysis on a bowl of chili, right? That just happened to have some hamburger and some beans and all your normal things in a bowl of chili. And just in a like cup and a half of chili, it was 28 grams of protein.
Yeah.
So
And
that's
probably a
what,
good amount of carbs, right?
yeah, yeah, a decent amount of carbs, absolutely, but all like great vitamin C. We've
Yeah.
got, bell peppers in there, onions, spices. And so that's why I want people to think about enjoy your food. Like, let's cook normal food because then you get the reward from when you're eating, which is super important because if you don't get reward from your meals because you're having some baked chicken breast and broccoli kind of meal, well, then you are going to seek out the candy and the sweets. And then you constantly feel like you're craving stuff that you don't really want to be filling your body up with. But a lot of this is coming from we've got to square away your meals first and foremost. We got to get those dialed in. And then we can look at how does that impact your relationship with food, how you're using food, how you're managing your physical activity and fueling for that. And it's such a more meaningful way to go about it. And it's just easier, it's simpler. And yes, we can check all those boxes in terms of making sure you're getting adequate protein, not too much, but not too little. Carbohydrates and all of those factors.
Yeah, that's very good advice. And I agree with you. I think most people don't have and I'll put myself in that category. Most people don't have a sense of how much of all these things are in their everyday foods or what they're actually eating, unless they're keeping
Mm-hmm.
track. And I tell people not to get obsessed about keeping track. So I think working with someone for a short period of time to just get a handle on it is good advice.
Well, and then people might be surprised that some of their normal meals that they used to enjoy eating might maybe were perfectly healthy and actually met their protein needs, for example. So,
Right.
some of those things. But, when someone has one egg with one slice of avocado toast and calls it breakfast, it's like that probably isn't exactly what we want. That might be okay, but we might need a little bit more if we are, concerned about some of those things. So it's kind of looking at what you're doing and leveling it up so that, yes, if we have concerns like insulin resistance or diabetes, we're addressing that with food choices and food balance. But then we're also like not always trying to eat so little because you're so worried about your weight.
Yeah. And that's a very common
Mm-hmm.
situation and a whole other podcast. As we wrap up, is there anything that we haven't talked about or anything you would like to leave our readers with?
I don't think so. We've talked about a lot. No, this has been great. I mean, it's a very interesting discussion, and I think it's an important one. And I guess the one thing I usually leave people with is if you are thinking so much and feeling stressed and overwhelmed or even fixating on your food and nutrition, that's probably a clue that you're overthinking and or you might want to get some support for kind of taming that down and feeling a little bit more confident about your food and eating because that stress and that anxiety is probably more problematic than any food itself anyway.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Val. I always appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, that's our show. Come on back next week when I sit down with trainer to triathlete champions Aaron Carson to talk all about breath work for training, mobility, recovery, and life. It is a great one. So come on back for that. And until then, as always, stay feisty. You've been listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I'm your host, Celine Yeager. The show is edited and produced by the strong, talented, and amazing women at Live Feisty Media. Follow us on social media at Feisty Menopause. And please help us spread the word. Screenshot and share this episode on your social media channels with the tag @Feisty Menopause. Share the show with your friends And please subscribe, like, review, and rate this show wherever you get your podcasts. Word of mouth and good reviews make it easier for other listeners to find. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay feisty.